the people of Vietnam use lanterns of stone? Did they hold ceremonies to reverence the opening of buds? Were they inclined to quiet laughter? Did they use bone and ivory, jade and silver for ornament? Had they an epic poem? Did they distinguish between speech and singing? Sir, their light hearts turned to stone. It is not remembered whether in gardens, stone gardens, illumined pleasant ways. Perhaps they gathered, once, to delight and blossom, but after their children were killed, there were no more buds. Sir, laughter is bitter to the burned mouth. A dream ago, perhaps, ornamented for joy. All the bones were charred. It is not remembered. Remember, most were peasants. Their life was in rice and bamboo. When peaceful clouds were reflected in the paddies, and the water buffalo stepped surely along terraces. Maybe fathers told their own sons old tales, when bombs smashed those mirrors. There was only time to scream. There is an echo yet of their speech, which was like a song. The report of their singing resembled the flight of moths in the moonlight. Who can say? It is silent now. The poem What Were They Like was written by British-born poet Denise Leverov. She moved to America and by the 1960s wrote this poem in opposition to the cruelties of the Vietnam War. It was written in the 1960s and therefore was a time of great conflict and cultural opposition against many conservative ideals, namely concentrated in the USA. Examples of this cultural movement are huge backings behind people who opposed present-day norms, such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela. This culture also took opposition towards the Vietnam War. Violent protests and mass demonstrations followed to express their oppositions against the many atrocities in the Vietnam War. Leverov reverberates these sentiments by demonstrating an interaction between a reporter and a Vietnamese war veteran. This protest and opposition is the premise of the poem's main message. In the poem, What Were They Like?, Denise Leverov echoes the sentiments of the 1960s and evokes a sense of opposition against the war campaigns that ravaged war communities in Vietnam, which faced the disappearance of their rich culture as a consequence. To enact this message, Denise's poem is split into two stanzas. These stanzas represent two different lines of dialogue and different speakers, as for each stanza has a different voice, tone, mood, and persona. The first stanza of the poem consists of a series of questions. Based on the series of questions and the specifics of the inquiries made, such as the asking whether the people of Vietnam used bone or ivory, or whether they, quote, revered the opening of buds, unquote, showed a level of professionalism and background research, unseen in a common person who wouldn't often ask complicated questions such as these. Language choices also allude to this, as the persona uses lexes such as ornament, inclined, and distinguished, which all have a scholarly and professional connotation to them, therefore allowing us to imply that the stanza may be from the perspective of a news reporter, or a scholar who prepares questions beforehand and seeks detailed answers to his or her detailed questions. These questions concern about the culture and life of the Vietnamese people during the war, and are often asked in a condescending manner, as the reporter goes as far as to question whether they had developed a musical understanding, as seen in the last verse of the stanza, which reads, quote, did they distinguish between speech and singing, unquote. These formatting of these questions also attributes to the tone of the reporter's voice and the way she asks these questions. These questions are written back to back and have no pause between each question. This illusion of continuous motion can be enacted through enjambment and anaphora. The first stanza features several examples of enjambment, and through this enhances the rhythm of the poem, making it seem like a barrage of questions from the reporter. Anaphoras are also present in his stanza, as every question begins with the word did. These anaphoras help the author show how the reporter had a continuous flow of questions, and the repetition of the word did gives the reporter a tone of insistency and urgency to these questions. All of these turns and tones contribute to an overall mood of insistency and rapidity to these, and it almost seems as the reporter was inconsiderate to the responder of these questions, which will be delved into the second stanza. The second stanza features the answers of the questions posed in the first stanza. Leverov takes the persona of a Vietnamese war veteran and begins answering the reporter's questions in a slow and paced manner. We can interpret that Leverov takes the persona of the Vietnam War veteran through the careful and pleasant descriptions of the communities and the cultures given by the speaker, in phrases such as, quote, water buffaloes step surely along terraces, unquote. The speaker gives a sense of imagery to the reporter which cannot be depicted by anyone else rather than someone who was there on the scene of the war, watching the water buffalo. Another important clue was the fact that many war veterans suffer from PTSD and have often had a hard time expressing and recalling memories from their duty. This war veteran, or the speaker, often uses lexes that are doubtful and somber, which also contribute to the poem's overall tone. Words such as perhaps, which repeated several times, show the insecurity and the uncertainty of the veteran, showcasing their case of PTSD. More examples of somber lexis is the use of words such as silent and scream, words that scream and evoke hopelessness and terror. Another important clue that supports uncertainty and gives a sense of incomprehensible horror is the often use of caesurae along the verses of the poem. These caesurae give a stuttering sensation to the reading of the poem, as if the veteran was stuttering all over himself, confused and struggling to remember the tragic days of the war. This imagery the veteran uses is also extremely detailed and inspected, as, when mentioned previously, that of which can only be told by someone who was there during the war. One phrase that also evokes particular intensity is the verse from the middle of the stanza, quote, laughter is bitter to the burned mouth, unquote. This piece of imagery enhances the sense, not only to taste, but to a sensation, to a burning one at that. It completely encapsulates the hopelessness, emotion, and the terror seen in the Vietnamese people when trying to endure the U.S. war machine. This ties in perfectly with the message Denise Leverov is trying to convey, and the overall mood of the poem. Leverov tries to give readers a sense of hopelessness and gut-wrenching fear against the war efforts by describing beautiful scenes of Vietnamese culture and seeing them disappear. We can see this by using the following quote. Perhaps they gathered once to delight and blossom, but after their children were killed, unquote. This invites us to deduce that the children are those who are entrusted of carrying down the culture and are dying, and with their death will lead to the downfall of the Vietnamese culture. This certain doom reaches its climax. Quote, all of the bones were charred. It is not remembered, unquote. As the bones and remains of the children and villages are charred and destroyed, the culture, rituals, tools, and future all crumble to the floor. The second part of the quote, it is not remembered, further solidifies that idea, that the veteran himself is forgetting and realizing that the culture is dying and taking a backseat to human greed over land and jealousy due to the war. Using these wide range of literary and sound devices such as imagery, enjambment, caesurae, assonance, consonance, and alliteration, Leverov descriptively and emotionally portrays how the war effort can intrude and make a culture rich in laughter and singing completely disappear and vanish. This is the end of the presentation. Now, the rest will continue with the rationale. My dramatic reading of the poem used many choices and accentuations to put emphasis on the meaning and the tones of the speakers and respondents. Since each stanza features different personas and offers different moods, each stanza is therefore read and interpreted differently. In the first stanza, as mentioned previously, the speaker has a quick and hastened pace, almost insisting the second persona to answer to his series of questions quickly so he can proceed to write his new story as soon as he can. Therefore, to captivate that urgency, I decided to read the entirety of the first stanza in a fast pace. I also decided to elevate my pitch at the end of every question to further captivate the viewer's insistency and the need for answers to these questions. However, the second stanza is very different in the sense that it is much more detailed and solemn. In this stanza, I paused along many key pensive and somber moments, especially when the Vietnamese veteran was delving into his descriptions about the rich Vietnamese culture, namely, the water buffalo stepping along the terraces. In this section of the reading, I zoomed in to the drawing of the man and demonstrated the horrors and the atrocities against the Vietnamese people and showed how these horrors played over and over again, almost torturing him in his mind. Near the last part reading of the poem, I focused on contributing an unvoiced reading to fully grasp the sadness and the fall of the Vietnamese culture, something that shouldn't be taken lightly, but with grace and respect. In this section of the video, I also drew the evolution of their culture, growth from something beautiful and progressively so down, and ultimately fall into disappearance and shrivel into nothingness. As the veteran says, quote, "Who can say? It is silent now." Unquote.